The sun hung like a molten coin over Dusty Hollow, Wyoming, in the summer of 1878, baking the cracked earth and casting long shadows across the town's single dusty street. The air shimmered with heat, carrying the tang of sweat and whiskey from the Rusty Spur Saloon, where laughter spilled out like a mocking chorus. Caleb Harrow, a lean cowboy with weathered hands and eyes that held the weight of too many lonely trails, tethered his mare, Juniper, to a post outside. His boots crunched on the dry ground, each step deliberate, as if testing the town's welcome. He'd been gone months, driving cattle across the high plains, and now, at 32, he sought nothing more than a quiet drink and a moment's rest. But Dusty Hollow had other plans for him. Inside the saloon, the air was thick with tobacco smoke and the clink of glasses. Caleb's entrance drew Glancish's broad shoulders, and quiet demeanor marked him as a man who carried his strength lightly, but the townsfolk knew his reputation. A former trail guide who'd led wagon trains through blizzards and ambushes, Caleb was a man of honor, solitary by choice, scarred by loss. His parents had died in a cholera outbreak when he was a boy, and a fiancée had succumbed to fever years later, leaving him to wander the West with only his horse and his principles for company. The saloon's patrons, a mix of ranch hands and drifters, whispered his name with a mix of respect and mockery. The lonesome cowboy, they called him, chuckling at his refusal to join their raucous nights. At the bar, Caleb ordered a whiskey, his voice low, barely audible over the din. The bartender, a grizzled man named Amos, slid the glass across the counter with a nod. But before Caleb could take a sip, a voice cut through the noise sharp, taunting, and all too familiar. "Well, look who's back. The hero of the plains, come to save us all." Vance Coulter, a wiry ranch hand with a cruel smirk, leaned against a table, his cronies snickering behind him. Vance was trouble, a man who thrived on others' misery, his influence growing among the town's rougher elements. Caleb met his gaze, unflinching, but said nothing, hoping to avoid a scene. Vance, undeterred, sauntered closer, his boots scuffing the floorboards. "Heard you've been out there talking to the stars, Harrow. Ain't you lonely yet? A man like you needs a woman to keep him warm." The crowd laughed, egging him on. Caleb's jaw tightened, but he kept his eyes on his drink, knowing Vance fed on reaction. The saloon grew quieter, sensing a spectacle. Then Vance's tone shifted, dripping with malice. "Fact is, we found you a bride. Ain't that right, boys?" His gang roared, parting to reveal a figure slumped in a corner, a woman in a faded blue dress, her body still, her face half hidden by auburn hair. Caleb's heart sank as he saw her. She was young, perhaps in her mid-20s, her delicate features pale with exhaustion. Her hands rested limply in her lap, and her legs, covered by a thin blanket, were unnaturally still. A crude wooden chair, barely more than a cart with wheels, supported her. The crowd's laughter grew louder, but the woman, her name, Caleb would later learn, was Eliza Canicapt, her eyes down, her lips pressed into a thin line. Shame and resignation radiated from her, a silent plea to be anywhere else. Vance strutted over, nudging her chair with his boot. "Meet your new Mrs. Harrow. Found her in Cheyenne, left behind like a broken wagon. Figured a saint like you'd take her in." The saloon erupted in cruel mirth, glasses clinking in mock celebration. Caleb's fists clenched, his whiskey forgotten. He'd seen cruelty before, rustlers abandoning injured men, towns turning away starving families, but this was different. This was a calculated humiliation, not just of him, but of a woman whose only crime was her vulnerability. He crossed the room in 3 strides, the crowd parting instinctively. Kneeling beside Eliza, he spoke softly, his voice steady despite the rage simmering within. "Ma'am, I'm Caleb Harrow. Can you tell me your name?" Her eyes, a deep hazel flecked with gold, lifted slowly to meet his. They held a storm of emotions, fear, defiance, and a flicker of hope she seemed afraid to trust. "Eliza Kane," she whispered, her voice hoarse, as if unused to kindness. They brought me here as a joke." Her words broke something in Caleb, a dam against the loneliness he'd carried for years. He stood, turning to Vance, his gaze cold as a winter wind. "You've had your fun, Coulter. Leave her be." Vance's smirk faltered under Caleb's intensity, but he recovered quickly, stepping closer. "What's that, Harrow? You taking her? Gonna play house with a cripple?" The word landed like a slap, and Eliza flinched, her hands tightening in her lap. Caleb's hand twitched toward his holster, but he stopped himself. Violence wouldn't undo this. Instead, he turned back to Eliza, his voice gentle but firm. "Miss Kane, I've got a cabin outside town. It ain't much, but it's safe. You're welcome there. No strings attached. I'll get you out of this place." The saloon fell silent, the crowd stunned by his resolve. Eliza searched his face, her expression torn between disbelief and desperation. "Why?" she asked, barely audible. "You don't know me." Caleb hesitated, then answered truthfully. "Because no one deserves this, and I reckon you've got more fight in you than they think." Her eyes glistened, but she nodded, a small, decisive gesture that felt like a pact. Vance laughed, breaking the tension. "You're dumber than I thought, Harrow. She can't even walk. You'll be nursing her till you're gray." His gang joined in, but Caleb ignored them, focusing on Eliza. He lifted her chair carefully, his movements deliberate, as if handling something precious. Her slight frame was lighter than he expected, and the blanket slipped, revealing legs that hung lifelessly. She tensed, but Caleb kept his eyes on hers, offering a reassuring nod. "Hold tight, ma'am. We're leaving." As he wheeled her toward the door, the crowd's laughter followed, a chorus of derision that clawed at his heart. But Eliza's hand brushed his arm, a fleeting touch that steadied him. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the plains in hues of gold and crimson. Caleb secured her chair beside Juniper, tying it with rope from his saddlebag. "It's a short ride," he said, mounting his horse. "You'll be safe, I promise." Eliza nodded, her face unreadable, but her eyes held a question. Could she trust this stranger who'd chosen her dignity over his pride? The ride to his cabin was quiet, the only sounds the creak of the chair and Juniper's hooves on the hardpan. Caleb's mind churned. He'd acted on instinct, driven by a sense of right that had guided him through years of hardship. But now, with Eliza's fate tied to his, doubt crept in. Could he care for her? Would she resent him as another burden? The cabin came into view, a small, sturdy structure of pine logs, nestled among sagebrush, with a single chimney trailing smoke. It was a lonely place, built for one, but tonight it would shelter two. He carried Eliza inside, setting her on a chair by the hearth. The cabin was sparsely cot, a table, a shelf of worn books but clean, the air scented with pine. "I'll fix a proper place for you tomorrow," he said, stoking the fire. "For now, rest. You're safe here." Eliza watched the flames, her voice soft. "I haven't felt safe in years, Mr. Harrow. Why are you doing this?" Caleb paused, meeting her gaze. "Because I know what it's like to be left behind, and I won't let that happen to you." As night fell, the cabin glowed with firelight, a fragile sanctuary against the cruelty of Dusty Hollow. Caleb spread a blanket over Eliza, who'd fallen into an exhausted sleep. He sat by the window, staring at the stars, his heart heavy with a new responsibility and a flicker of hope. This woman, broken by circumstance but unbroken in spirit, had stirred something in him. The jest that brought them together was cruel, but Caleb's honor, forged in the wilds of the West, promised something more, a chance for redemption for both of them. The Wyoming dawn broke gently over Caleb Harrow's cabin, a soft glow filtering through the sagebrush and painting the pine walls in hues of amber. The air carried the crisp scent of dew and earth, a quiet promise of a new day. Inside, the cabin was still, save for the faint crackle of embers in the hearth. Caleb stood at the window, his calloused hands wrapped around a tin mug of coffee, his eyes tracing the horizon where the plains stretched endlessly. He hadn't slept much, his mind tethered to the woman now resting in his cot across the room. Eliza Kane, a stranger just hours ago, had upended his solitary world with her quiet resilience and the weight of her unspoken pain. Eliza stirred, her hazel eyes fluttering open to meet the unfamiliar ceiling. For a moment, Panic flickered across her face, her hands gripping the blanket as if to anchor herself. Then she saw Caleb, his silhouette framed against the dawn, and her tension eased, replaced by a guarded curiosity. She shifted slightly, her legs motionless beneath the quilt, a reminder of the accident that had stolen her mobility 3 years prior. At 26, she'd learned to navigate a world that often looked away, but the cruelty of Dusty Hollow's saloon had stripped her bare, leaving her wary of kindness. Caleb's offer of shelter felt like a lifeline, but she couldn't shake the fear that it came with a price. "Morning, Miss Kane," Caleb said, his voice low, steady, like the rhythm of a slow river. He crossed to the hearth, adding a log to coax the fire back to life. "Coffee's on, and I've got some biscuits baking. Ain't much, but it'll warm you." Eliza watched him, her expression unreadable. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, as if he sensed her need for space. "You don't have to do this," she said, her voice soft but edged with defiance. "I'm not your responsibility." Caleb paused, meeting her gaze. Her eyes held a storm pride warring with vulnerability. A woman who'd been broken but refused to crumble. "Reckon I don't have to do anything," he replied, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "But I want to. You're welcome here as long as you need." He turned back to the fire, giving her room to process his words. Eliza's hands tightened on the blanket. Kindness was a rare currency in her world, often laced with pity or expectation, yet Caleb's offer felt different, rooted in something she couldn't yet name. The cabin was modest, its simplicity a reflection of Caleb's life. A rough-hewn table held a few books, dog-eared volumes of Whitman and the Bible, while a single shelf displayed a carved wooden horse, a relic from his childhood. The walls, chinked with clay, bore the marks of a man who'd built his refuge with care but no thought of company. Eliza's presence filled the space with a new energy, a quiet challenge to the solitude Caleb had worn like armor. He'd lost so much: parents, a love, a sense of home, that he'd convinced himself loneliness was enough. Now, with Eliza here, that conviction wavered. Breakfast was simple: biscuits, a pat of butter from the town's mercantile, and coffee strong enough to wake the dead. Caleb set a plate before Eliza, pulling a stool close to the cot so she could eat comfortably. "I'll work on a proper chair today," he said, noting how she struggled to sit upright. "Something to give you ease, let you move around." Eliza's fork paused midair, her brow furrowing. "You're a carpenter now, too?" she asked, a hint of skepticism softening into curiosity. "Learned a bit guiding wagons," Caleb said, leaning back. "Had to fix axles, build shelters in a pinch. Ain't no master, but I can make something sturdy." He hesitated, then added, "I want you to feel at home here, Miss Kane, not like a guest who's overstayed." Eliza's throat tightened. Home was a word she hadn't dared to claim since the accidental wagon overturning on a rain-slicked trail, her spine crushed, her dreams of teaching school children buried under the weight of her new reality. "Call me Eliza," she said finally. "And, thank you, Caleb, Lau." Their conversation unfolded slowly, like a flower opening to the sun. Eliza spoke of her past in fragments: of childhood in Ohio, her love of books, the schoolhouse where she'd taught until the accident. Her voice grew distant when she mentioned her family, who'd sent her west with a cousin, only to be abandoned when her condition became a burden. Caleb listened, his silence an invitation, not a judgment. He shared little of himself, but when he mentioned losing his fiancée to fever, his eyes darkened, and Eliza glimpsed the grief he carried like a shadow. Outside, the day warmed, the plains alive with the hum of cicadas and the rustle of wind through sagebrush. Caleb stepped onto the porch, his tools in hand, and began measuring a plank of pine he'd stored in a lean-to. He envisioned a chair for Elizalo, with a curved back for support, wheels to give her freedom. As he sawed and sanded, his thoughts drifted to her strength, the way she'd faced the saloon's cruelty with quiet dignity. He'd known hardship, but hers was a different kind, fought in stillness, in the mind and heart. It stirred something in him, a desire to protect, but also to know her, to see the woman beneath the pain. Inside, Eliza watched through the window, her hands folded in her lap. Caleb's focus, his care in shaping the wood, unsettled her. She'd grown used to being invisible, a burden to be passed off. Yet here was a man who saw her, not her chair, not her limitations, but her. It frightened her, this possibility of being valued, because it meant risking hope. She'd hoped before hoped for healing, for acceptance only to be crushed. But Caleb's actions, his quiet insistence on her worth, chipped away at her defenses. By midday, the heat was oppressive, and Caleb brought a tin cup of water to Eliza, his shirt damp with sweat. "Got the frame started," he said, wiping his brow. "It'll take a couple days, but it'll be right." Eliza nodded, her voice catching. "You're spending a lot of effort on me. I don't know how to repay you." Caleb knelt beside her, his gray eyes steady. "Ain't about repayment, Eliza. It's about doing what's right. You've got a place here, same as me." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Eliza's chest ached, a mix of gratitude and fear. She wanted to believe him, to trust this sanctuary he offered. But trust was a fragile thing, easily shattered. Caleb seemed to sense her hesitation. He stood, giving her space, and returned to his work, the rhythmic sound of his hammer, a steady pulse in the quiet afternoon. Eliza closed her eyes, letting the sound anchor her, a reminder that she was no longer alone. As evening fell, the sky turned a deep indigo, stars blinking into existence. Caleb lit a lantern, its glow softening the cabin's edges. He cooked a simple stew beans and a bit of bacon, serving Eliza first. They ate in companionable silence, the weight of the day settling around them. "You ever read Whitman?" Eliza asked, nodding toward the books on the shelf. Caleb chuckled, a rare sound that warmed the room. "Tried. Ain't much for poetry, but I like the way he sees the world, big, messy, worth lovin'." Eliza smiled, a small, genuine curve of her lips. "I used to read him to my students. They'd grown, but they listened." Her voice softened, wistful. "I miss that teaching, sharing something bigger than myself." Caleb leaned forward, his elbows on the table. "You could teach again, Eliza. Ain't nothing stoppin' you but time and a place." Her smile faded, doubt creeping in. "Not with these legs. No one wants a teacher who can't stand." Caleb's gaze was unflinching. "Folks want a mind like yours, someone who sees the world clear. I've seen it, just talking to you today." Eliza looked away, her heart racing. His belief in her was a gift, but it felt too heavy, too precious to hold. She changed the subject, asking about his life on the trails, and Caleb obliged, spinning tales of starry nights and narrow escapes from rustlers. His stories painted a life of freedom, but also of solitude, and Eliza sensed the ache beneath his words. As night deepened, Caleb spread a blanket on the floor, insisting Eliza keep the cot. "I'm used to hard ground," he said, settling by the hearth. Eliza watched him, his face softened by firelight, and felt a stirring she hadn't known in years. Not pity, not obligation, but a quiet longing to know this man who'd given her a sanctuary. "Good night, Caleb," she whispered, her voice thick with unspoken gratitude. "Good night, Eliza," he replied, his eyes lingering on her a moment longer. The cabin fell silent, the fire's glow a fragile shield against the vast Wyoming night. Outside, the plains whispered secrets to the stars, and inside, two wounded souls began to weave a bond, tentative but true, in a sanctuary built on honor and hope. The Wyoming summer waned, its relentless heat giving way to cooler evenings that carried the faint promise of autumn. Outside Caleb Harrow's cabin, the plains stretched under a sky bruised with gathering storm clouds, their edges gilded by a fading sun. The sagebrush rustled, whispering secrets of unrest, as if the land itself sensed the trouble brewing. Inside, the cabin glowed with the soft light of a lantern, its warmth a fragile bulwark against the gathering darkness. Caleb sat at the table, oiling his revolver, his movements precise but heavy with thought. Across from him, Eliza Kane adjusted her new chair, a sturdy pine frame with iron wheels, crafted by Caleb's hands over days of careful labor. Her fingers traced the smooth armrests, a quiet gratitude in her touch, though her hazel eyes were clouded with worry. A week had passed since Caleb brought Eliza to his cabin, and in that time, their tentative alliance had deepened into something unspoken but profound. She'd begun to share more of herself, her love of poetry, her memories of teaching children to read under Ohio's wide skies. Caleb, in turn, had revealed fragments of his past, the trails he'd blazed, the losses that had carved his solitude. Yet their fragile sanctuary was under siege, not by storms or wolves, but by the malice of Vance Coulter and his crew, whose cruelty had taken root in Dusty Hollow like a weed. The trouble began in whispers, rumors slithering through the town's saloons and mercantiles. Vance, stung by Caleb's defiance in the Rusty Spur, had spun a vicious tale. Caleb was keeping Eliza for profit, exploiting her disability to swindle sympathy, or worse. The lies spread, poisoning the town's perception, and by the time Caleb rode in for supplies, he felt the weight of suspicious glances. Shopkeepers who once greeted him with a nod now hesitated, their hands lingering near cash boxes. At the livery, a stable hand muttered, "Heard you got yourself a charity case, Harrow. What's she worth to you?" Caleb's silence was his shield, but each barb stoked a fire in his chest, not for his own sake, but for Eliza's dignity. Today, the malice had escalated. Caleb had taken Juniper to a trail beyond Dusty Hollow, checking traps he'd set for small game to supplement their meager stores. The path wound through rocky outcrops, the air thick with the scent of dust and pine. He'd barely dismounted when hoofbeats thundered behind him. Vance and three of his men, lean, hard-eyed ranch hands named Tuck, Riley, and Boone, blocked the trail, their horses snorting in the heat. Vance leaned forward in his saddle, his smirk sharp as a blade. "Out here all alone, Harrow? Or you hidin' that cripple somewhere?" Caleb's hand rested near his holster, his voice steady. "Say what you came to say, Coulter, and move on." Vance laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Folks are talkin'. Say you're playin' the hero to scam the town. Maybe we ought to check on that woman, see what you're really up to." The men behind him shifted, hands twitching toward guns, testing Caleb's nerve. He met Vance's gaze, unyielding. "Eliza's safe, and she's no concern of yours. Ride away, or this gets ugly." The standoff stretched, taut as a bowstring, until Vance raised a hand, signaling his men to back off. "You're a fool, Harrow," he spat. "Keepin' a burden like her'll drag you down. We'll see how long your honor lasts." They wheeled their horses and rode off, dust swirling in their wake, but Caleb knew this was no retreat, only a pause. Vance's pride was wounded, and men like him didn't forgive. As he returned to the cabin, his traps unchecked, Caleb's mind churned with the need to protect Eliza, not just from physical harm, but from the venom of lies that could isolate her further. Inside, Eliza sensed his unease the moment he crossed the threshold. Her chair was positioned by the window, where she'd been reading one of Caleb's books, a worn copy of Whitman's Leaves of Grass. She set it down, her eyes searching his face. "What happened out there?" she asked, her voice soft but insistent. Caleb hesitated, not wanting to burden her, but her steady gaze demanded truth. He sat across from her, his hands clasped on the table, and recounted the encounter, sparing no detail. "Vance is stirring trouble," he concluded, "trying to turn the town against us, against you." Eliza's lips pressed into a thin line, her hands tightening in her lap. She'd known cruelty before, relatives who'd called her useless, towns that had turned her away, but this was different. This was a deliberate campaign to strip her of the fragile dignity she'd begun to reclaim. "They think I'm a weight on you," she said, her voice trembling with suppressed anger. "Maybe they're right. I can't fight, can't run, I'm just here." The admission cost her, each word a wound reopened. Caleb leaned forward, his gray eyes fierce with conviction. "You ain't a weight, Eliza. You're a person, same as me, with a mind sharper than most. What Vance says, don't change that." He reached out, then stopped, his hand hovering, unsure if his touch would be welcome. "I chose to bring you here, and I'd choose it again. Let 'em talk. We'll prove 'em wrong." Eliza's eyes glistened, a tear slipping free, but she nodded, a small, resolute gesture that mirrored the strength Caleb had seen in her from the start. Their conversation turned to her past, a way to anchor themselves against the storm outside. Eliza spoke of the accidental rain-soaked trail, a wagon overturning, the moment her world went dark. She'd been a teacher, vibrant and full of dreams, until her spine betrayed her. Her cousin had taken her west, promising care, but abandoned her in Cheyenne when the burden grew too heavy. "I learned to stop hoping," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Until you." The words hung between them, raw and unguarded, and Caleb felt his heart lurch, a longing he hadn't dared name. He shared his own scars, in return the fever that took his fiancée, Mary, leaving him to wander the trails alone. "I thought I could outrun the hurt," he said, staring at the lantern's flame. "But it follows, quiet-like, till you face it." Eliza listened, her silence a balm, and in that moment, they were two souls meeting in the shadow of loss, finding solace in shared vulnerability. The cabin, once a solitary refuge, felt alive with their connection, its walls holding their whispered truths. Outside, the storm clouds thickened, a low rumble of thunder echoing across the plains. Caleb stepped onto the porch, scanning the horizon for signs of Vance's men. The trail was empty, but the air felt charged, heavy with intent. He returned to the cabin, bolting the door, his revolver now cleaned and loaded. "If they come, I'll handle it," he told Eliza, his voice calm but firm. She nodded, her hands steady as she opened her book again, a small act of defiance against the fear creeping into her heart. As night fell, the storm broke, rain lashing the cabin and lightning illuminating the plains in stark flashes. Caleb sat by the window, his eyes on the darkness, while Eliza read aloud from Whitman, her voice a steady thread weaving through the tempest. "I am large, I contain multitudes," she recited, and Caleb turned, struck by the strength in her words, the way they seemed to encompass her own complexity, broken yet whole, fragile yet fierce. The lantern flickered, casting shadows that danced like specters of Vance's malice. Caleb's thoughts drifted to the town, to the lies festering in its heart. He'd always been a loner, content to pass through Dusty Hollow without roots, but now he had something to defend, not just Eliza, but the possibility of a life beyond solitude. Eliza, too, felt the shift, her fear tempered by a growing trust in Caleb's resolve. She'd been a burden, a jest, a shadow until this cowboy saw her as a woman, worthy of respect. The storm raged on, a mirror to the turmoil beyond the cabin's walls. Caleb moved to the hearth, adding a log, his silhouette strong against the firelight. Eliza watched him, her heart aching with a truth she wasn't ready to voice. This man, with his quiet honor, was becoming her anchor, and Caleb, glancing at her, felt the same stirring of hope, fragile as the flame before them, but bright enough to challenge the shadow of malice closing in. The Wyoming summer faded into a golden twilight, the plains around Caleb Harrow's cabin bathed in a soft amber glow that softened the harsh edges of the world. The sagebrush swayed under a cooling breeze, carrying the faint scent of wildflowers and the promise of autumn's approach. The cabin stood sturdy against the vast landscape, its pine logs glowing in the dusk, a beacon of refuge for two souls who had found each other in the unlikeliest of circumstances. Inside, the air was warm, with the scent of fresh-baked cornbread, and the lantern cast a gentle light over the table where Caleb and Eliza Kane sat, their faces illuminated by a quiet intimacy that had grown over weeks of shared survival. Eliza's new chair, a testament to Caleb's craftsmanship, allowed her to move with a grace she hadn't known since her accident. Tonight, she'd insisted on helping with supper, her hands steady as she shaped the cornbread dough, a small act of reclaiming her agency. Caleb watched her, his gray eyes soft with admiration. Though he said little, he'd spent the day reinforcing the cabin's defenses, checking the shutters, oiling the hinges, ensuring his revolver was ready, knowing Vance Coulter's threats were no idle boasts. But now, in this fleeting moment of peace, the world outside felt distant, and the cabin was a universe of their own. The hook of this evening was a simple one, yet profound. Caleb had built a ramp to the porch, a sloping path of smooth pine that gave Eliza access to the world beyond the cabin's walls. He'd unveiled it at sunset, wheeling her outside to see the stars emerging in a sky of deepening indigo. Eliza's breath caught as the plains unfolded before her, their vastness both daunting and beautiful. "You did this for me," she said, her voice thick with wonder, her hazel eyes reflecting the first pinpricks of starlight. Caleb nodded, his hands resting on the chair's handles. "Reckoned you'd want to see the world, not just hear about it. Ain't right to keep you cooped up, V." Their conversation flowed like a slow river, meandering through memories and dreams. Eliza spoke of her teaching days, how she'd read poetry to her students under Ohio's oaks, their young faces alight with curiosity. "I wanted them to see the world's beauty," she said, her fingers tracing the armrest of her chair. "Even when it's hard, there's something worth finding." Caleb listened, his heart stirring at her resilience, the way she held on to light despite years of darkness. He shared his own stories nights on the trail, guiding wagons through mountain passes, the stars his only companions. "Always thought I'd find a place to belong," he admitted, his voice low. "Never figured it'd be here with you." The words hung between them, raw and unguarded, and Eliza's cheeks flushed, though she didn't look away. She'd spent years building walls around her heart, convinced her paralysis made her unworthy of love. But Caleb's steady presence, his quiet acts of care-building the ramp, listening to her stories, seeing her as a woman, not a burden, had begun to dismantle those walls. She felt a warmth she hadn't known since before the accident, a longing that both frightened and exhilarated her. Caleb, too, was grappling with a heart's awakening. He'd buried his dreams of love with Mary, his lost fiancée. But Eliza's strength, her sharp mind, her gentle spirit, had kindled something new, a hope he was afraid to name. They returned inside as the air grew chill, the lantern casting shadows that danced like memories. Eliza opened her book of Whitman, her voice steady as she read. "We too, how long we were fooled, now transmuted, we swiftly escape as nature escapes." The words felt like a confession, a recognition of their shared transformation. Caleb leaned forward, his elbows on the table, captivated by her voice, the way it wove poetry into the fabric of their evening. "You make those words live," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Ain't never heard anything so fine." Eliza smiled, a rare, unguarded expression that lit her face. "You're learning, Caleb. Poetry's just life, dressed up in words." She paused, then added softer. "You've given me a reason to feel alive again." The admission was a gift fragile and precious, and Caleb's heart thudded, a rhythm he hadn't felt in years. He wanted to reach for her hand, to bridge the space between them, but hesitated, unsure if she was ready for such a gesture. Instead, he stood, clearing the plates, his movements a shield against the intensity of his feelings. Outside, the plains were quiet, but the threat of Vance Coulter loomed like a storm on the horizon. Caleb had heard whispers in town Vance's men were spreading lies, claiming he was using Eliza to scam the townsfolk, to gain favor or land. The rumors had taken root, and Caleb felt the town's trust slipping, even from those who'd once respected him. He'd faced danger before: rustlers, blizzards, bandits, but this was different. This was a fight for Eliza's dignity, for the fragile bond they were building. He vowed to protect her, no matter the cost, but the weight of that promise pressed heavy on his shoulders. Eliza sensed his burden, her perceptive gaze catching the tension in his jaw. "You're worried about Vance," she said, not a question but a statement. Caleb set the plates down, turning to face her. "He's not done with us," he admitted. "He's got a mean streak, and I shamed him in front of his men. That's a debt he'll want to settle." Eliza's hands tightened in her lap, but her voice was steady. "I've faced men like him before, people who see weakness and pounce. You don't have to fight this alone, Caleb. I may not walk, but I can think, plan, help." Her words struck him, a reminder of her strength, not in body but in spirit. He nodded, a faint smile breaking through his worry. "Reckon we're a team then. You keep that sharp mind of yours ready, and I'll keep my gun close." The agreement sealed something between them, a partnership forged in trust, and the cabin felt smaller, warmer, as if their shared resolve had shrunk the world to this moment. As the night deepened, Caleb lit a second lantern, placing it near Eliza so she could read. She taught him a poem, line by line, her voice patient as he stumbled over the words. "It's not about getting it perfect," she said, her eyes bright with encouragement. "It's about feeling it." Caleb tried again, his deep voice halting but earnest, and when he finished, Eliza clapped softly, her laughter a melody that filled the room. For the first time in years, Caleb felt a lightness, a joy that made the cabin feel like a home. But the peace was fleeting. A distant sound, hoofbeats, faint but deliberate, cut through the night. Caleb's hand went to his revolver, his body tensing as he moved to the window. The plains were cloaked in darkness, but a flicker of movement near the trail caught his eye. "Stay here," he whispered, grabbing his hat. Eliza's hand shot out, grasping his wrist, her touch electric. "Be careful," she said, her voice tight with fear, not for herself, but for him. Caleb nodded, his heart racing at her touch, and slipped outside, the night swallowing him. The hoofbeats faded, a false alarm, but Caleb scouted the perimeter, his senses honed by years on the trail. The tracks were fresh, 2 riders, likely Vance's men, probing, watching. He returned to the cabin, his face grim. "They're circling, testing us," he told Eliza, bolting the door. She nodded, her expression resolute. "They want to scare us. We won't give them that." Her courage steadied him, and he sat beside her, the lantern's glow a fragile shield against the encroaching threat. They talked into the night, their voices low, sharing dreams they'd buried long ago. Eliza spoke of a schoolhouse she'd imagined, a place where children could learn without fear. Caleb confessed his longing for a family, a legacy beyond the trails. Their words wove a tapestry of possibility, each revelation a step closer to love. When Eliza's hand brushed his, neither pulled away, the contact a silent vow. The cabin, once a solitary refuge, was now a crucible, forging a bond that could withstand the malice outside. As dawn approached, the stars faded, and Caleb stood, his resolve hardened. "We'll face whatever comes, Eliza," he said, his voice steady. She met his gaze, her eyes bright with a fire he hadn't seen before. "Together," she replied. And in that word, Caleb found a purpose he'd thought lost forever. The plains stretched beyond the cabin, vast and unforgiving, but within these walls, a heart's awakening had begun, a love that would defy the shadows gathering on the horizon. The autumn storm descended on Caleb Harrow's cabin with a fury that shook the Wyoming plains, its howling winds rattling the shutters and lashing rain against the pine walls. Lightning cracked the sky, illuminating the sagebrush in stark flashes, as if the heavens themselves were warring over the fate of the small homestead. Inside, the cabin was a fortress of flickering lantern light, its warmth a defiant stand against the tempest outside. Caleb stood by the window, his revolver in hand, his gray eyes scanning the darkness for the threat he knew was coming. Eliza Kane sat in her wheeled chair, her hands steady despite the fear in her heart, a kitchen knife tucked beside her, a gift from Caleb, a symbol of her resolve to fight in her own way. The hook of this night was a chilling escalation. Vance Coulter and his men, driven by spite and emboldened by the storm's cover, had come to break Caleb's spirit and reclaim their twisted sense of dominance. For weeks, Vance's malice had festered, his lies poisoning Dusty Hollow, painting Caleb as a fraud and Eliza as a burden. Now, under the storm's cloak, he aimed to end the defiance that had humiliated him in the saloon. The cabin, once a sanctuary, was now a battleground, and the stakes were nothing less than the lives and honor of the 2 souls within. Caleb had sensed the attack coming, the hoofbeats he'd heard nights before, the fresh tracks circling the cabin, had been warnings Vance's men probing, planning. He'd spent days preparing, reinforcing the door with an iron bar, stacking firewood to block vulnerable windows, and teaching Eliza the cabin's layout for defense. "If it comes to a fight," he'd told her, his voice calm but grave, "you're my eyes where I can't see. Eliza had nodded, her hazel eyes fierce with determination. Her paralysis confined her body, but her mind was a weapon, sharp and unyielding, ready to stand with Caleb against the storm of men and weather. The first sign of trouble came with a thud against the door, heavy and deliberate, cutting through the wind's wail. Caleb's hand tightened on his revolver, his body low as he moved to the window. Through the rain-streaked glass, he glimpsed shadows, 4 men, their forms blurred but unmistakable. Vance's voice rang out, sharp and venomous. "Harrow, open this door, or we'll burn it down. Hand over that cripple, and maybe we let you walk away." The words stung Eliza, her jaw clenching, but she met Caleb's gaze, shaking her head slightly. They would not surrender. Caleb's voice was steady, carrying over the storm. "You're on my land, Coulter. Leave now, or you won't leave at all." A harsh laugh answered, followed by the crack of a rifle. The bullet splintered the shutter, missing Caleb by inches, and he dropped to the floor, motioning Eliza to stay low. She wheeled her chair to the corner, where a narrow gap in the wall gave her a view of the rear approach. "They're splitting up," she whispered, her voice calm despite the chaos. 2 circling to the back. Caleb nodded, marveling at her composure, and shifted to cover the front, his revolver ready. The siege began in earnest, Vance's men hammering the door while others probed the cabin's weaknesses. Caleb fired a warning shot through the shutter, the report echoing like thunder, and heard a curse as one man, Tuck, by his voice retreated. Eliza's sharp eyes caught movement at the rear, where Riley was prying at a loose board. "He's at the back window, left side," she called, her tone precise. Caleb swung around, firing through the gap, and Riley yelped, clutching his shoulder as he stumbled into the rain. The teamwork was seamless, their trust a lifeline in the dark. Vance's rage grew, his shouts piercing the storm. "You think you can hide her, Harrow? She's a burden and you're a fool." The taunts were meant to provoke, but Caleb's focus was ironclad, his thoughts on Eliza's safety. She, too, refused to falter, her mind racing as she scanned the cabin for strategic advantages. "The chimney," she said suddenly, her voice urgent. "They could drop something downfire, or worse." Caleb cursed under his breath, realizing she was right. He grabbed a heavy iron pot, positioning it in the hearth to block the flue, his movements swift but careful. The storm's ferocity mirrored the battle, rain seeping through cracks and wind shaking the walls. Vance's men, frustrated by the cabin's defenses, grew reckless. Boone tried to smash the rear door, his axe splintering wood, but Eliza's quick thinking saved them. "The table," she directed, pointing to the heavy oak slab. Caleb dragged it across, wedging it against the door, and Boone's next blow met resistance, his curses drowned by thunder. Eliza's strategic mind, honed by years of navigating a world that underestimated her, was proving as vital as Caleb's gun. Inside, the air was thick with tension, the lantern's glow casting stark shadows. Caleb reloaded his revolver, his hands steady despite the ache in his shoulders. Eliza watched him, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and pride. This man, who'd taken her in against all reason, was fighting not just for survival but for her honor, her right to exist as more than a jest. She gripped the knife, its weight grounding her, and whispered, "We're stronger than they think." Caleb glanced at her, his eyes softening for a moment. "Damn right we are," he replied, a flicker of a smile breaking through. The siege stretched into hours. Each assault met with resistance. Vance's men tried fire, tossing a burning rag through a cracked shutter, but Caleb smothered it with a blanket, his hands blistered but unyielding. Eliza kept watch, her voice a steady guide, alerting him to movements in the dark. "They're tiring," she noted, catching the sluggishness in their steps. "The storm's wearing them down." Caleb nodded, his mind racing. If they could hold out until dawn, the light might expose Vance's men, giving them an edge. But Vance was desperate, his pride a spur. He rallied his men for a final push, their shouts rising over the wind. "Break it down now," he roared, and the front door shuddered under a coordinated assault. Caleb positioned himself by the window, firing through the gap, and heard Riley cry out, hit in the leg. The attack faltered, but Vance's voice cut through, unrelenting. "You can't win, Harrow. She's not worth this." Eliza's hands trembled, not with fear but with fury. "He's wrong," she whispered, her voice fierce. "We're worth everything." Caleb's heart swelled at her words, a fire igniting within him. He moved to her side, checking her position. "You're my strength tonight," he said, his voice low, raw with emotion. Eliza met his gaze, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "And you're mine," she replied, the words a vow. Their bond, forged in crisis, was a weapon as powerful as any gun, and they wielded it with unspoken unity. As the storm began to wane, the attack slowed, Vance's men exhausted and wounded. Caleb and Eliza held their ground, their breaths synchronized in the quiet moments between assaults. She suggested a trap, leaving a shutter slightly ajar to lure an attacker. Caleb agreed, positioning himself to strike. When Tuck took the bait, peering through, Caleb's fist met his jaw, sending him sprawling into the mud. The move bought them time, but Caleb knew Vance wouldn't stop until forced. The turning point came near dawn, the sky lightening to a bruised gray. Eliza's sharp ears caught a new sound: hoofbeats, not from Vance's men but from the east. "Someone's coming," she whispered, hope flickering in her voice. Caleb peered through the window, spotting a lone rider, Jed Harper, the old miner who'd always respected him. Jed's arrival shifted the balance, his rifle raised as he shouted, "Coulter, back off, you're done here." Vance's men hesitated, their resolve crumbling under the threat of reinforcement. Caleb seized the moment, calling out, "It's over, Vance. Leave, or you'll answer to more than me." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the fading rain. Vance's voice, when it came, was bitter, defeated. "This ain't the end, Harrow." But the hoofbeats of his retreat told a different story, his men limping away into the dawn. Caleb slumped against the wall, exhaustion crashing over him, but his eyes found Eliza's, and her steady gaze anchored him. The cabin was battered but standing, a testament to their defiance. Eliza wheeled to Caleb's side, her hand brushing his arm, a touch that spoke of survival and something deeper. "We did it," she said, her voice thick with relief. Caleb nodded, his throat tight. "Together," he replied, and in that word lay the promise of a love tested by fire, a bond that no storm could break. The plains outside were quiet now, the storm spent, but within the cabin, a new strength had been forged. A siege of honor won by two hearts united against the darkness. The first light of dawn crept over Dusty Hollow, Wyoming, painting the town's single street in hues of rose and gold. The storm that had raged through the night had passed, leaving the air crisp and the ground slick with mud, reflecting the sky like a mirror. The plains stretched beyond the town, their sagebrush glistening with dew, a quiet testament to the resilience of the land. In the heart of Dusty Hollow, outside the Rusty Spur saloon where this story had begun, a crowd gathered, their faces a mix of curiosity and unease. The events of the night had spread like wildfire, and now, as the sun rose, Caleb Harrow and Eliza Kane stood at the center of a reckoning, their bond forged in fire about to reshape the town's heart. The hook of this moment was electrifying. Caleb, battered but unbowed, had subdued Vance Coulter's gang with the aid of Jed Harper, the old miner whose timely arrival had tipped the scales. Now, Eliza, wheeled into town in her chair, was ready to speak, to reclaim her dignity and defend the man who had become her protector and partner. The townsfolk, once swayed by Vance's lies, stood in uneasy silence, their whispers stilled by the sight of the woman they'd mocked and the cowboy who'd defied cruelty for her sake. This was not just a confrontation but a moment of redemption, where truth would challenge shame and love would defy scorn. Caleb stood beside Eliza, his revolver holstered but his presence a shield, his gray eyes scanning the crowd for any sign of lingering threat. His shirt was torn, his hands blistered from the night's battle, but his posture was resolute, a man who'd fought not just for survival, but for honor. Eliza, in her pine chair, sat tall, her auburn hair pulled back, her hazel eyes burning with a fire that belied her physical limitations. The knife Caleb had given her rested in her lap, a symbol of her strength, and her voice, when she spoke, would carry the weight of years of silenced pain. Jed Harper stood nearby, his ancient rifle cradled in his arms, his weathered face a quiet endorsement of their cause. The confrontation began outside the saloon, where Vance and his men, Tuck, Riley, and Boone stood bound, their faces sullen, their bravado shattered. The night's siege had left them wounded and defeated, their attempt to break Caleb and Eliza reduced to a failed gamble. Vance, his arm bandaged from a bullet graze, glared at Caleb, his smirk gone, replaced by a bitter scowl. "You think this changes anything, Harrow?" he spat, his voice carrying over the crowd. "You're still a fool, saddled with a burden no one else wanted." The words were meant to wound, to rekindle the town's doubt, but they fell flat, met by murmurs of disapproval. Eliza's hands tightened on her chair, but her voice, when it rose, was clear and steady, cutting through the morning air like a bell. "My name is Eliza Kane," she began, her gaze sweeping the crowd, forcing them to meet her eyes. "I was brought to this town as a jest, left in that saloon to be laughed at, discarded like trash. But this man," she gestured to Caleb, her voice unwavering, "saw me as a person, not a burden. He gave me a home when you turned away. He fought for me when you believed lies." Her words were a blade, sharp with truth, and the townsfolk shifted, their faces flushed with shame. Caleb watched her, his heart swelling with pride and something deeper, a love that had grown in the crucible of their shared struggle. Eliza's courage, her refusal to be defined by her paralysis, was a light that burned brighter than any storm. She continued, her voice rising with conviction. "Vance Coulter spread lies to tear us down, to make you doubt Caleb's honor. But last night, he and his men came to our home, tried to burn it, to break us. We stood together, and we won, not because of pity, but because of strength, mine, and the truth we carry." The crowd was silent now, their earlier skepticism replaced by awe. A woman, older, with gray hair pinned tightly, stepped forward, her eyes wet. "We were wrong, Miss Kane," she said, her voice trembling. "We listened to gossip, not truth. I'm sorry." Others nodded, their murmurs of agreement rippling through the crowd. Jed Harper cleared his throat, his gruff voice adding weight. "I saw what happened out there. Harrow and Miss Kane held off 4 armed men with nothing but grit and a plan. Anyone still doubting their worth can answer to me." Vance's face twisted, his desperation palpable. "She's twisting the truth," he shouted, struggling against his bonds. "Harrow's using her to play the hero, to scam this town." But his words lacked power, drowned by the crowd's growing resolve. A shopkeeper, Amos from the saloon, stepped forward, his face grim. "Enough, Coulter. We've seen enough to know who's honest here." The tide had turned, and Vance's influence crumbled like dry earth under rain. Caleb, sensing the moment, stepped forward, his voice low but carrying the weight of his conviction. "This ain't about me," he said, his eyes on Eliza. "It's about Hera, about a woman who's stronger than any of you gave her credit for. I fought for her because she's worth it, because she's my partner, not my burden." The words, raw and unpolished, struck the crowd like a hammer, and Eliza's breath caught, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. She reached for his hand, her fingers brushing his, a silent acknowledgement of their shared journey. The townsfolk began to disperse, some offering quiet apologies, others pledging help to repair the cabin's damage. Jed took charge of Vance and his men, promising to deliver them to the territorial marshal in Cheyenne. As the crowd thinned, Caleb wheeled Eliza to a quiet corner of the street, near the livery where Juniper stood tethered. The morning sun warmed their faces, and the air felt lighter, as if the town had exhaled its shame. Caleb knelt beside her, his heart pounding with a truth he could no longer hold back. "Eliza," he began, his voice rough with emotion, "I ain't a man of fancy words, but these past weeks have changed me. You've changed me. I've been running from a home, from love, for years, thinking I didn't deserve it. But you've shown me what it means to fight for something real." He paused, his gray eyes searching hers. "I love you, Eliza Kane. Not out of pity, but because you're the strongest, most beautiful soul I've ever known. I want you by my side, as my equal, my partner. Will you stay with me, build a life together?" Eliza's breath hitched, her eyes filling with tears that spilled freely now. She'd spent years believing love was lost to her, that her paralysis had stolen her chance at a future. But Caleb's words, his unwavering belief in her, shattered that belief. "Caleb," she whispered, her voice trembling with joy, "I thought I'd forgotten how to hope, but you've given it back to me. Yes, I'll stay. I love you, too." Her hand found his, their fingers intertwining, a vow sealed in the morning light. The moment was theirs, a redemption hard won through courage and trust. The townsfolk, witnessing from a distance, saw not a cowboy and a paralyzed woman, but two souls who had defied cruelty to find each other. Amos approached, his hat in hand, offering to organize repairs for the cabin. A young girl, clutching her mother's hand, ran forward, pressing a wildflower into Eliza's lap, a gesture that brought fresh tears to her eyes. Dusty Hollow, once a place of scorn, was beginning to heal, its heart softened by the truth of Caleb and Eliza's stand. As they returned to the cabin, Caleb pushing Eliza's chair along the muddy street, the plains stretched before them, vast and forgiving. The storm scars remained splintered wood, broken shutters, but the cabin stood, a symbol of their resilience. Inside, Eliza paused by the hearth, her hand lingering on the knife, now a relic of their fight. "We did more than survive," she said, her voice steady. "We built something." Caleb nodded, his heart full. "We built us." The dawn had brought redemption, not just for Eliza's dignity or Caleb's honor, but for a town that had learned to see beyond lies. As the sun climbed higher, casting its light over the plains, Caleb and Eliza stood together, their love a beacon that would guide them into a future neither had dared to dream of until now. Spring unfurled across the Wyoming plains in 1879, a riot of wildflowers painting the landscape in hues of violet and gold, as if the earth itself celebrated renewal. Caleb Harrow's cabin, once a solitary outpost on the edge of Dusty Hollow, had transformed into a vibrant homestead, its pine walls now joined by a blooming garden and a small, sturdy schoolroom of fresh-cut timber. The air was sweet with the scent of lilacs and new grass, carried on a breeze that whispered of hope and beginnings. The cabin, battered by the autumn siege, stood stronger now, its scars a testament to the resilience of the two souls who had made it a home. Today, under a sky as boundless as their dreams, Caleb and Eliza Kane were to be married, their love a beacon that had reshaped not just their lives, but the heart of a town. The hook of this day was a quiet, radiant ceremony in Dusty Hollow's modest church, a wooden structure at the town's edge, its steeple gleaming in the morning sun. The townsfolk, once swayed by Vance Coulter's lies, now gathered to witness a union born from adversity, their faces alight with respect and quiet joy. Eliza, in a simple white dress sewn by the town's seamstress, sat in her wheeled chair, her auburn hair woven with wildflowers, her hazel eyes shining with a peace she'd thought lost forever. Caleb stood beside her, his broad shoulders clad in a clean shirt, his gray eyes soft with a love that had grown through storm and struggle. This was not just a wedding but a triumph, a love forged in the wild that had defied cruelty to become a legacy. The church was filled with familiar faces. Jed Harper, the old miner whose cunning had turned the tide during the siege, stood as witness, his weathered face creased with a rare smile. Children from the town, some clutching homemade gifts, sat in the pews, their chatter a lively hum. Amos, the saloon keeper, had closed his bar for the day, a gesture of amends for the night he'd failed to stop Vance's cruelty. The preacher, a kind-eyed man named Reverend Holt, spoke of love as a force stronger than any storm, his words weaving a thread of hope through the gathered crowd. Eliza's hand rested in Caleb's, her fingers steady, her heart full, as they prepared to vow their lives to each other. Their journey to this moment had been one of transformation. After the siege, with Vance and his men delivered to the territorial marshal, Dusty Hollow had begun to heal. The townsfolk, shamed by their initial complicity, had rallied to repair the cabin, bringing lumber, food, and apologies. Eliza, once a figure of pity, had found her voice, and with Caleb's encouragement, she'd proposed a schoolroom, a place where she could teach again, sharing the poetry and knowledge that had sustained her through years of hardship. Caleb had built it with his own hands, each nail driven with love, creating a space where children could learn under Eliza's sharp, compassionate mind. The schoolroom, attached to the cabin, was a marvel of simplicity and purpose. Its walls were lined with shelves of books, some donated by the town, others sent from Eliza's sister in Ohio, who'd written tearful letters of reconciliation. Eliza taught reading and arithmetic, her voice vibrant as she guided children through Whitman's verses or simple sum. The students, at first hesitant, soon flocked to her, drawn by her warmth and the way she saw potential in each of them. Caleb, too, had found new purpose, farming the land around the cabin and guiding travelers through the nearby passes, his skills as a trail guide now serving a community that had come to respect him. Their love had deepened in the quiet moments between these labors. Evenings by the hearth, where Eliza read poetry and Caleb listened, his heart stirred by her voice. Mornings in the garden, where he pushed her chair along paths he'd smoothed, their laughter mingling with the hum of bees. They'd shared their fears of being a burden, his of losing another love, and their dreams of family, a legacy, a home that stood against the wild's uncertainties. Each revelation had bound them closer, their bond a tapestry woven from trust and mutual strength. The ceremony began with a hymn, the children's voices rising in a melody that filled the church with warmth. Reverend Holt spoke of resilience, of love that endures through trial, his words echoing the journey Caleb and Eliza had traveled. These two, he said, gesturing to them, have shown us what it means to stand together, to see beyond weakness to the heart within. Caleb squeezed Eliza's hand, his throat tight with emotion. She looked up at him, her eyes glistening, and for a moment the world narrowed to just them, two souls who had found each other in the crucible of pain. When the time came for vows, Caleb spoke first, his voice steady but thick with feeling. Eliza, I was a man adrift, thinking the wild was all I'd ever know. You showed me a home ain't just a place, it's a person, a heart. I vow to stand by you, to build with you, to love you through every storm and every dawn. His words, simple but raw, drew murmurs of approval from the crowd, and Eliza's tears fell freely, her smile radiant. She took a breath, her voice clear and strong. Caleb, you saw me when I was invisible, gave me a place when I had none. I vow to be your partner, your strength, to love you with all I am, now and always. No. The exchange of ring-simple bands forged by a blacksmith who'd witnessed their stand against Vance's, a moment of quiet power. Caleb slipped the ring onto Eliza's finger, his hands gentle, and she did the same, her touch a promise. Reverend Holt pronounced them man and wife, and the church erupted in cheers, the children tossing wildflowers that fluttered like blessings. Caleb knelt beside Eliza, kissing her softly, their embrace a seal on a love forged in the wild, unyielding and true. As they left the church, the townsfolk followed, offering gifts and words of gratitude. A girl named Lily, one of Eliza's students, pressed a drawing into her handsaw sketch of the schoolroom, with Eliza and Caleb standing together. Jed Harper clapped Caleb on the shoulder, his eyes twinkling. You done good, Harrow. Built something worth keepin'. Amos offered a barrel of flour, his face flushed with sincerity. For the school, Miss Eliza. For what you're givin' our kids. The gestures, small but heartfelt, wove Dusty Hollow into their story, a town redeemed by their example. Back at the cabin, the garden bloomed with lilacs and sunflowers, a testament to their shared labor. Caleb carried Eliza over the threshold, a tradition adapted to their love, her laughter bright as he set her in her chair. The schoolroom stood ready for its first lessons of the season, its windows open to the spring air. That evening they sat together on the porch, the stars emerging in a sky that felt like a canvas of possibility. Eliza leaned against Caleb, her hand in his, and whispered, "You made me whole again, Caleb. Not my body, but my heart." Caleb's voice was soft, reverent. "And you gave me a reason to stay, Eliza. This," he gestured to the cabin, the garden, the plains, "this is our legacy." The words held the weight of their journey, from a cruel jest to a love that had transformed them both. The children's laughter from a nearby picnic, organized by the town, drifted on the breeze, a reminder of the community they'd inspired. The plains stretched beyond, vast and untamed, but the cabin was a sanctuary, its walls holding the echoes of their vows. Caleb pushed Eliza's chair through the garden, pausing to kiss her gently, their love a quiet flame that burned brighter than any storm. Dusty Hollow, once a place of scorn, now looked to them as a symbol of what honor and love could achieve. Their story, born in the wild, had become a legend, a tale of two hearts that found each other against all odds, forging a future as enduring as the Wyoming sky. As the Wyoming sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over Caleb and Eliza Harrow's homestead, the couple sat hand in hand on their porch, the garden blooming with the promise of another spring. Their love, born from a cruel jest in Dusty Hollow's saloon, had weathered storms of malice and emerged as a beacon of hope. The schoolroom buzzed with children's laughter, Eliza's voice guiding young minds, while Caleb's fields thrived, a testament to their shared resilience. The cabin, once a lonely refuge, now stood as a monument to a love forged in the wild, unyielding against the odds. Their story had transformed the town, teaching Dusty Hollow that true strength lies in seeing beyond weakness, in choosing honor over scorn. The lesson lingered like the scent of lilacs. Love, rooted in respect and courage, can heal even the deepest wounds and build a legacy that endures. Caleb and Eliza, two souls once adrift, had found their forever home in each other, proving that even in the harshest wilderness, compassion creates miracles. If this tale of love and redemption touched your heart, join our community at Wild West Love Tales. Subscribe to our channel to hear more stories of passion and perseverance in the untamed West. Leave a comment with the number 8, a symbol of eternal love, to share in Caleb and Eliza's triumph. Your support keeps these stories alive, inspiring us all to find light in the darkest moments. Click now, and let's ride into the next tale together.